Hello and welcome to our presentation today, The Language of Buildings Terms to Know. We are really excited to have you here this afternoon. We are just a moment or two later than what we normally start, so I'm going to dive right into our introductions and get this learning experience started for you all. Slide. All right, my name is Mallory Bauer, and I have the privilege of serving as the field representative for the Michigan Historic Preservation Network. I will be your host and moderator, so as we dive into this webinar, I do want to familiarize you with Zoom software if you are unfamiliar. If you have any questions throughout the presentations, please enter them as you think of it. We are collecting questions in the Q&A box. So if you do not see your toolbar, it might be at the bottom of your screen or the top of your screen. Just wiggle your mouse and it should appear, and it'll be like two little talk boxes. It says Q&A at the bottom. Click on that, type in your question, and we will answer them throughout the presentations. There'll be some moments and then there will also be some time at the end. This is a 1-hour webinar, so that kind of helps if you set the context of this presentation. We have been doing a couple of 1.5-hour webinars, but this is 1 hour. If you keep your eye on the chat box, I will be dropping in links that are helpful and any resources that may be brought up during this conversation. But do not fret if you miss them. We are sending out a recording of this webinar to all who registered as soon as we have it processed, in addition to a 1-page document with all the links and resources that are brought up in this learning opportunity, so you will have that all together in one spot. All right, we do have some polls just to get a sense of who is joining us today. So I'm going to launch those before I turn it over to our presenter. So if you can click the answer that reflects your participation or who you are best, and you'll answer all 3 poll questions and then hit submit at the bottom. So mostly we want to know, what is your role in preservation? Are you just a general advocate? Are you here for a line of work? And then we want to have an idea, a sense of familiarity with architectural terms before we dive in. And then again, the last one is the kind of why are you here? Are you looking for general knowledge? Or are you in the process of starting a survey in your own community? So we have about 56 participation. I like to wait until we have about 80. So we're ticking up now. So I'll give everybody just a few more seconds. All right, excellent. Well, thank you for everyone who has participated. I am going to end the poll now. And then I'm going to share the results so our presenters and other panelists have an idea. So we have several people from historical societies here today. That's great. We have a majority of people who have described a building using technical terms. That's great. General knowledge, historic district study committee member. So a little bit more diverse there at the bottom. So excellent. Thank you so much for your time in doing that. We'll move to the next slide real quick. Just have a few other things before turning it over to Sherry. All right, so you all are here for the language of buildings, terms to know. We're going to go over some terminology, styles, and forms as you may that you may need to know when you're filling out a survey form. All right, next slide. And our webinar today, I'm with the Michigan Historic Preservation Network. We are the statewide nonprofit, and our mission is to advocate for Michigan's historic places that contribute to our economic vitality, sense of place, and connection to the past. We are a membership-driven organization, so if you are a member, thank you so much for supporting us. If you are not yet a member, I encourage you to visit our website at www.mhpn.org and find out all the amazing things that we do. And I hope you will join us and become a member today. Next slide. And finally, these webinar series that we've been putting on since April have been generously funded through a grant through the Michigan Council for Arts and Cultural Affairs. So we want to thank them for their support of these programs. And so without further ado, I am going to turn it over to Sherry. Sherry is joining us today from Firefly Preservation, and she is a consultant who is graciously sharing her time and expertise with us today. So I will turn it over to you, Sherry.
Okay, thanks, Mallory. And thanks everybody for joining us this afternoon. I'm glad to see that most everybody has some familiarity with the terms we're going to talk about today. So as Mallory said, I'm going to talk about the language of buildings and some terms that will be helpful for conducting an architectural survey. So just for my own curiosity, I'm wondering where people are from, and Zoom doesn't let you do a poll where you can type something in. So I would really love it if you guys wouldn't mind to just tap in on that chat box and type in there where you're from. I'm from Chelsea, and the home of Jiffy and the Purple Rose Theater, and really it's just to satisfy my own curiosity. So I hope that you'll share where you're joining us from today. The past couple of webinars in this series have been about survey, and Katie Kolakithis from the SHPO has been talking about what is survey, why do we do survey, what are the SHPO expectations for it. And so the idea for today's webinar is to give you some of the vocabulary that you need to do what Katie's been describing for the last couple of webinars. So mostly we're going to focus on these three things: form, style, and type. So we're going to talk about what these things mean and what are the most common ones that you will find doing an average community survey in your average community in Michigan. Quick disclaimer, I have less than an hour for a whole lot of information. I'm going to go kind of fast, and I'm not going to include all of the things, but I am going to include the ones that I see the most. So I hope that that will be helpful and give you a place to start. So Katie introduced a couple of forms, a field form and a more formal survey form that SHPO uses for survey projects. So let's review those so I can show you where on the form the stuff we're going to talk about today would go. So this is the field data form that Katie shared with everyone following the last webinar. And this green box is generally what we're going to talk about today. Let me blow that up a little so we can actually see it. And so we're going to talk about forms. We're going to talk about architectural classification and use a little bit as well. And then this is the building structures and objects survey form. And again, we're looking at this green box here. I'll blow that up again. And so we're going to look at property types and then architectural styles and forms. So I highly recommend either investing in style guides or getting them from your library if you're going to do a survey. Nobody has all of this memorized. I do this for a living and I use these books every day. So don't feel like you have to memorize all of the things I'm going to talk about or all of the things in these books or any other publication that you might see. The one I use the most is McAllister's Field Guide to American Houses. I think that's true for most people in this field. That's sort of the standard. It focuses on houses, but it's also good for commercial and other types of buildings because a lot of the elements and forms that she describes translate across different building types. Another one I like is Harris's American Architecture. This is a glossary of architectural terms. It can be a little overly technical, so I would caution you to use this sparingly. If you're doing a community survey, you want to use words that your community will understand. So although there is a fancy word for everything, you don't necessarily have to use it. And using just plain descriptors is often preferable during a survey. But still, in your effort to understand styles and forms and ornament elements, this is a good illustrated glossary of terms. These are also good places to start if you don't know anything about architecture at all. Macalester in particular in the beginning has a glossary of form and style. It's a pictorial key, and she actually identifies what styles go with those things. So you could look up your window type and see what styles it might be, and then go to those parts of the book and figure out what you're looking at. So it's really good if you're new to survey or new to architectural terminology. It's a good place to start. Another source of really useful information are the National Register bulletins published by the Park Service. And this one I have pictured here is Bulletin 16B. And this is how to complete the National Register form. You're not completing a National Register form during survey, so don't be misled by this being here. But the reason I put it in here is it has a lot of really good lists. It lists material types and style types and context, areas of significance that you might consider when you're doing a survey. So again, if you're sort of new to survey, those lists can be really helpful as a starting place. Mallory is going to send out a handout that has these three and many more resources on them. There are books that just show great architecture in the state of Michigan. There are books that are specific to towns, like there's one for Ann Arbor, for example. There's a bunch for Detroit. So those can be really useful if you're in one of or near an area that has a book like that. There are also thematic publications like the New Michigan Modern book or Barns of the Midwest that have a more focused topical. And I mean, there are lots and lots of publications out there. So remember that you don't have to remember everything. You just need to go find the information somewhere. So we're going to start with form. In a nutshell, this is the shape of the building. We're going to look at roof forms specifically. This is an important character defining feature of any building. And it's not just the shape of the roof, but it also is how the pieces of the building are coming together. So again, a really important character defining feature. Gable is the most common roof form. So side gable and front gable are there at the top. Bottom left is a gable front and wing, also called an upright and wing. Cross gable is similar to this, but the gables would actually cross and form a T or an X sort of a shape rather than just an L. And that can be hard to see sometimes because it extends to the rear of the building to form a T frequently, and you can't always see that from the street. But those are cross and gable front and wing. The bottom right is a center gable. This is called a AAA also in some parts of the country, mostly in the South. But if you read a lot of architecture books, you may come across that term, and that's what that means. Hip is also really common. So the top left is your basic hip form. If you can see how it's sort of flattened on the top, and if that extended all the way to a point like a pyramid, it would be pyramidal. Pyramidal is a type of hip, so you can use either word to describe those. But when it's flattened on top like that, that's a hip. The top right is another hip, but this one has projections coming off of it. So the trick when you're figuring out a complicated roof line like this is to find the primary mass. That's basically the centerpiece that all the other things are coming off of. So this one is a hip with projecting gables. And that's the most common. It's really common in Queen Anne, which I'll show you some really good complicated Queen Anne's in a little bit. But again, you want to just look for that sort of primary mass, that centerpiece that everything else pops off of, and that's going to be your roof form. We have cross hip in the bottom left. You can see how the primary mass is the wing on the right part of this building, and it extends all the way to the back. And then you have another hipped wing coming off to the left. So that's a cross hip. Mansard, I think most people know this one. It's highly recognizable and kind of popular, even though it's not super common. This is a double slope roof form. So if you can see my mouse here, we have two pitches to this roof. There's one here and then one here. And it can curve inward this way, or it can curve outward instead. So you can have a convex or a concave shape there. And you have dormers in the broad part of the roof, which you see here. And that's characteristic to that type of roof also. Gambrel is another double slope roof form. So it's somewhat less common than gable or hip, but certainly not rare. The top left is a center gambrel. Top right is it's a cross gambrel, but you can't see the other piece. Trust me, this one's in Chelsea. It's a cross gambrel. Commercial and civic buildings often have parapet or flat roof lines. So we have a commercial block with a parapet roof, and then we have a flat roof school building there. We can pause here and see if anyone has any questions on form. Mallory, I don't know if anyone's typed anything in, or if you have a form question, go ahead and type it in and we'll give you a minute.
I can answer one that got answered in, or asked in the chat.
Great.
There's a question about windows being not included on the field form. We decided that it was a little too complicated to try to make checkboxes for window descriptions because it's so varied. So the thought is that you can write that down in the additional description section at the bottom of the form. So that's as simple as that.
And I'll tell you how I handle that. I have a field form that I've made myself because I do work in multiple states and different states ask for different things. Mostly the same, but there's a little variation. So my form I can use wherever I'm working. I also did not include windows on it. I do a field sketch and I draw the building and I write notes around it. So I'll have my box and note what my roof line is and what types of windows I see. And it might be 6/6 in the front and 2/2 in the back, or whatever it might be, and wood here and vinyl there. And so I just write it all on a field sketch. So that's another way. And it's helpful for me because then I don't have to look back at my pictures as much when I'm writing. I've noted everything. I don't have to squint at my screen and try to figure out what things are because I've already taken those notes.
Yeah, it can be really hard once you get back and if you don't take really good notes when you're out in the field and doing something like the field sketch to actually figure out, is that final sometimes? It can be really tricky sometimes to figure out. So doing that helps you kind of prevents you from having to go back out and redo some of your field work. If, you know, that, and two, if there's a difference between when you actually do your work and when you start processing your forms, you're not going to remember things.
Right. So that was the only question, Sherry, that's come in thus far, but I will take a moment and thank Katie Kolakithis from the SHPO's office, who is here today, to also be on hand to answer any questions that may come up about survey in particular. But I just wanted to one quick question. Sherry, as you're talking, it was really helpful when you used your mouse to highlight the mansard roofs. So if you could do that in the future, that would be great.
I'm glad that's visible because I'm planning to do that a lot for style.
Perfect.
Pointing out elements. So I'm glad you guys can see that. Okay, so let's move on to style then. So Style refers to the character defining features that make the building historically identifiable. So it's a number of things working together to place the building in its historical time and geography. So one form is one element of style. Ornamentation is another piece of style. Geography matters. Some things start on the East Coast and move west, or vice versa. Some things appear first in urban areas, but linger longer in rural areas. And time. Time is so important to identifying style. A common pitfall when learning about architectural styles is to forget about time. So for example, federal style buildings were built during the colonial period. So a side gabled, highly symmetrical house with a semicircular fan light built in 1790 is going to be federal style. However, a similarly side gabled, symmetrical house built in 1990 is definitely not federal style. So don't forget to keep time attached to your style. Also, a word of caution that not everything has a style. Some buildings are just buildings. They're called vernacular instead, and sometimes they might be vernacular with details that are a nod to a particular style of the day, or they have some element of a popular style. But if they don't have a collection of those character defining features, then it's just a vernacular building. And so don't feel like you have to assign a style to everything. Likewise, some buildings will have many styles. Sometimes we can't make up our minds, so we put lots of things on a building. So if there are clearly like two styles, go ahead and say it's a Greek revival / Italianate or whatever it might be. Totally okay. And there may also be so many styles that you have no idea how to define it, and you can call that vernacular or eclectic, and those are good terms to use in that situation. A quick apology again. I have a lot to do in a short period of time. I'm going to go through these pretty quick. Get a good look at the buildings fast because we're going to go sort of quick through them. We're going to start with Greek Revival because this is really the earliest you're going to see with any regularity in Michigan just because of when we were settled here. So this is a temple type example with that full facade portico. We have, see if we can get my mouse back here. We have classical columns that'll be the full height of the building. You have dental detailing most of the time. You have pediments like this, pedimented gables. So we have dental detailing there too. And then we have side lights and transom over the door. We have classical pilasters on this one too. This is such a nice example. You won't always see quite this much detail, which is why it's a good teaching example. I can show you all of the things. This is a more modest example and was originally more common. I think you'll see more of the temple-like ones now because we kept them. They have survived a little better. These littler buildings, little 1.5 story, usually side gable, symmetrical, usually have 6/6 windows. Again, the transom and side lights, and they're often divided into little rectangular or square boxes like this too. And this one has a band of trim rather than that dental detailing, so it's a little more modest an application of the style, but a lot of these have not survived except as a part of something else. So you might see this on the back of a bigger building, or you might see this on the bottom of a taller building. And sometimes this just gets lost in the middle of something that's been added onto and added onto and added onto. But every once in a while, we see a little cutie patootie like this out there. Gothic Revival is not super common, but it's certainly not rare, and it's highly identifiable. People usually recognize this one right away. It's very pointy and very delicate. Usually, it's not super common as a residential style. It's more common to churches, and I'll show you a couple of those in a minute. But you're going to see really steep gables and like these little dormers. They're very narrow and very steep. They're just pointy. They're just pointy. And this one-story porch is pretty typical. They usually have some kind of turned or sawn woodwork. This lintel shape is called a drip mold, and this is very characteristic of the style. And also here in the gable, these verge boards or barge boards are usually very elaborate, kind of lacy looking. So all of that comes together to give us this sort of pointy, delicate gingerbread house kind of look. And they typically have some sort of gable facing the front, whether it's a gable front and wing like this or some kind of cross or just front gable. But you're going to have these decorative gables facing out toward the front of the house. It is more common to religious architecture. Often they are masonry, and this one has a lot of texture to the exterior with the rough cut stone. We have buttresses attached. We have a lot of decorative stonework that adds texture to the building. The pointed arches are a giveaway for Gothic. So here over the door, here over these vents. Again, very pointy. So we have pinnacles and steep gables. These little finials up on top of the gable peak sort of add to the vertical feel of this style. The window tracery over here in the large window. And it can be in the stone like this, or it can be within the window itself. And you have foil windows a lot. If you're a Girl Scout, you know what trefoils are, or if you just like Girl Scout cookies. This is a quatrefoil. They look like clover and are a nice decorative element. Sometimes they're just round decorative windows. And this is also, I know Katie mentioned in the last couple of webinars that you should take your pictures when the leaves aren't on the trees. And this is why. I had a hard time getting a picture of this church, but I was determined to do it. This tree is all in the way. So it covers a bit of that window, but if it was winter, we wouldn't have that problem. So there's a practical lesson from Katie's previous webinars. Here's a rural example of these religious Gothic Revival building. This is a Methodist church in Bel Air. It's where my husband is from. It doesn't have a stoplight, so it's a very, very small place. And this is a surprisingly lovely church to find in a place as small as Bel Air is. It's frame, so you'll see that more commonly with rural examples, but it has these buttresses, and it's also very pointy, and it has all the finials and the pointed arch windows, this pointed arch transom over the door. So it's still very pointy and delicate. Italianate, on the other hand, is boxy and sturdy in comparison to Gothic Revival. So it's not quite as fussy as Gothic Revival either. So normally you have 2 or 3 stories with 1-story porches. I'll be honest, I'm pretty sure these porches have been replaced, so don't look at them too much. Sometimes they have bays like this. It might just be a bay window, or it can be a full height projecting bay like this. Narrow arched windows. And then on top of the windows, you have these window hoods or sort of heavier lintels. And they're usually some kind of masonry, either brick or stone. And then brackets. All the brackets. These guys bought out the bracket store. They have all the brackets. And that's a very Italianate element too. This is a cute little octagonal version. There's sort of a pocket of octagon Italianate in the Midwest. So you might see one of these out and about. This has a more commonly what you would expect from the porch, with more elaborate detailing Here are the window hoods again, tall, narrow windows, brackets at the cornice, and then this one has a cupola. You see that a lot in residential Italianate buildings.
Sherry, could you go back to there was a question about the first Italianate, that brick one. Is
Yes.
that two separate houses?
I think now it is a duplex, and I saw this during a conference and just pulled over and took a picture because I thought it was cool. So I don't know a lot about the history of it, if it was built as a duplex or if it just functions as one now. It's not uncommon to see multiple porches on a complicated Victorian era house like an Italianate or a Queen Anne. So I hesitate to make assumptions about how it was built, but it is a duplex now.
Thank you.
We have a lot of Italianate downtowns. We don't have very boring downtowns in this state at all. But you know, I mentioned at the beginning, McAllister Style Guide is helpful not just for houses, but for other types of buildings. And this is a good example of why. We're looking at the same stylistic elements here. We have tall, narrow windows. We have elaborate lintels, the brackets and decoration at the cornice, and in general, a tall, narrow aesthetic. And that's true of Italianate residential buildings and Italianate commercial buildings. And so you can use that book for more than just houses. Second Empire is mostly residential. Once in a while, you'll see it on commercial buildings. It's not very common, again, though not rare. Very identifiable also. It has the characteristic mansard roof, double slope there with the dormers. There are often some kind of cornice bracket that'll be under the roof line. We see it here on the bay window too. These often have towers. This is a pretty modest, very fussy, but pretty modest example. Taller residential Second Empires often have a tower that's just a little bit taller, maybe a half story or story taller than the rest of the house. We have bay windows on two sides. This one's on a corner, so there's one facing each street. And a lot of fussy Victorian era detailing. So the delicate woodwork, turned and sawn woodwork you'll see on these ones too. And speaking of fussy, this is one of the most complicated and elaborate buildings I've ever seen in my life, anywhere, in any state. It's such an impressive example of the Queen Anne style, and such a great way of explaining during a webinar how complicated Queen Anne is and what a character defining feature that complexity is. So behind this tower is the primary mass. It's hard to see from the angle I'm taking the picture at, but there's a hip roof back there. And then we have projecting gables on both sides. We have these porches at the second story that project, a wraparound porch. We have bay windows that project off. We have this little gable projecting off the porch. Very irregular roof line. We throw a tower in just for fun. And then we have other things projecting and creating texture within this building. So in some places we have weatherboard, in others we have shingle, and not just plain shingle, we have scalloped shingle. And then here we have some brackets. Here we have a cutaway bay to create a little more texture there because we didn't have enough. Large porches are common to Queen Anne, wraparound porches like this. A lot of fussy woodwork, delicate sawn or turned gingerbread kind of woodwork. So a very complex and usually delicate style. There's a lot going on with Queen Anne. This is sort of an interesting brick version, but again, you still have a complex roof line. So we have a few gables on this one rather than a hip, a round tower. This is a conical roof. And we get texture by adding stone details here and above the door. We have decorative brickwork that creates texture. We even threw in some shingle in the gable just for fun. So the porch is just as complicated with the turned posts and brackets and a lot of sawn work and detailing on that porch. So another really complex and highly ornamented example. So a quick word of caution here. Sometimes Queen Anne becomes a sort of catch-all for the fussy late 1900s buildings. So make sure that you're seeing, and this is true for all the styles, before you name it that style, make sure that you're seeing a combination of character defining elements and form and ornamentation. Make sure the time is right for your location so that you're not mislabeling. And along those lines, we'll take a quick look at a vernacular building. This has a pretty basic form with the gable front and wing with a couple of nods to the Queen Anne style. So we have a nice little decorative ornament here in the gable. And then we have a wraparound porch that has a little extra gable thrown in for some ornamentation. So those are Queen Anne elements, but this is not a Queen Anne house. If you think about the last two things that we looked at, this is not Queen Anne. So you want to call this vernacular and then say it has a Queen Anne verge board or a Queen Anne type wraparound porch or something like that. So you want to recognize the style of those extra details, but don't attach the style to the house. It's just vernacular. On the other end of the spectrum, we have this guy. This is not at all vernacular. This is a gorgeous Romanesque Revival basilica in Grand Rapids. And Romanesque Revival is also called Richardsonian and Richardsonian Romanesque. Any of those words would apply. They have complicated roof lines too. It's sort of a Victorian era thing. So again, we have a gable here with towers and projecting gables and a dome in the back, and there's a lot going on. Textured masonry again, so we have the sort of rough cut stone making up most of the building, but then you have smooth stone detailing, buttresses over here on the main part of the sanctuary, and some stone detailing at the cornice line. So a lot of change and texture in the walls. Arched windows and doors with these heavy masonry surrounds, very characteristic to Romanesque. And lots of stone details. So we have a stone belt course down here. We have some stone trim up here on this part of the belfry tower. So you see just all of this masonry coming together to give you a very massive, heavy, imposing sort of a feel. This one's a little more modest. This is a cute little railroad depot, and it has an asymmetrical form that's a little more typical to this style than the relative symmetry of the basilica. But we have characteristic rough stone walls, multicolored in this case, a round tower here on what is actually the front of the building, but I did not climb on the railroad tracks to take a picture from the other side. And this building has rectangular windows rather than arched ones, but here on the street side, you see this little square window, but the fan light over it gives you the arched feel of a Romanesque, and you get this, this stone surround where the stones have clearly been intentionally placed into a window surround. So you get sort of that heavy masonry feel, even in this smaller and more modest building. Colonial Revival, popular around our centennial. And so you see a lot of the classical elements from the colonial styles come back, hence the name. They tend to be side gabled like this and very symmetrical. They have little entry porches. This gable with sort of a rounded bottom is a very characteristic colonial revival. The entry is usually accented with classical surround, so you would have some kind of pediment. This one's a broken pediment, and usually there are pilasters too. This has been partially enclosed, so my guess is that part of a more elaborate surround may have been lost when that change was made, but the broken pediment remains. And then the porch is supported by some kind of round column or classical column like we see here. And unlike the colonial styles, colonial revival has grouped windows. So you'll often see windows in pairs, or even over here on the wing, we have a group of 3. You'll see that sometimes too. And you'll see arched windows like this, or Palladian windows sometimes too. It's really popular, at least around here, in school buildings. And they're very symmetrical. Again, we have a very elaborate classical entry here with a broken pediment and dental detailing and pilasters. There's a nice classical motif carved into the stone above the windows on the 2nd floor. The cupola and the red brick are very common to colonial revival educational buildings. And then the detailing at the cornice too. So this is a really nice colonial revival school. Tudor revival is somewhat less common, but also a highly identifiable style. This false half timbering is what really gives it away. They have steep gables, and there'll be almost always a gable facing the front of the building. At least the upper sash of the windows usually has some kind of divided light. So here we have small, I think this is 20 lights in the top. You might have diamond panes or leaded glass instead. And the chimneys are usually really decorative, and sometimes they're prominently placed on the front of the building and have decorative brickwork on them. So you can look for that too.
Hey, Sherry, we had a question going back to
Yes.
the first colonial revival about a broken pediment. Could you define?
You can actually see it better on, oops, I've gone too far, sorry. You can see it better here on the school because there's nothing impeding your view, but a pediment normally is a full triangle, and instead this middle part is sort of carved out, so it's broken. So that's what that term means.
Excellent, thank you.
Sure. So craftsmen, often they are side gabled like this with a big dormer on the front. Sometimes they're front gabled with a front gabled porch. Sometimes these are just referred to as bungalows. That's not a style, that's a form. So make sure you call them craftsman bungalows. Bungalow is correct, but it's not a style. So make sure you identify that they are craftsmen. The porches have square wood posts. These ones have little recessed panels on them. Sometimes they're tapered on a brick or a stone pier. They have very wide eaves, and often they have a knee brace or some kind of bracket in the eaves. Exposed rafter tails are really common in craftsmen, and you can date a lot of outbuildings with that detail as well. So sometimes garages or sheds will have exposed rafter tails, and that can point you to a 1930s or 40s construction, sometimes 1920s construction. They tend to have divided light, at least in the upper pane as well. Usually it's some kind of vertical pane rather than these tiny squares. This is sort of unusual, it's kind of neat. And they often have textured walls too. So we have weatherboard here on the first floor, but shingle in the gable and on the dormer and on the porch as well. So you'll see a lot of times you'll see texture like that with craftsmen. Ranch style is one story, long, low. They have really simple entry stoops. Sometimes it'll be a stoop that extends from the house. Sometimes it'll just be sheltered by the eaves. The eaves are usually pretty wide on ranch houses. This one's got some nice little side lights. You'll see that pretty frequently. Picture windows are an important character defining feature. This one has casement windows, but you'll also see horizontal pane windows. 2/2 horizontal panes are really common in ranch houses. They often have an attached garage or carport. The style was becoming popular as cars were really becoming popular. People wanted a place to park them and not have to walk to their house in the rain. So you see carports and garages quite a lot. And they often have a wide interior chimney, usually somewhere toward the middle of the house, and they're just these really wide slab chimneys. A word of caution here, when you're using ranch to describe the style, again, like my previous warning, make sure that you're seeing a combination of character defining features. If it's one story, it's not necessarily a ranch, although all ranches are one story. So just keep that in mind. Another word of caution with this is to remember that these are in fact historic. A lot of us either built or grew up in ranch houses. We're very comfortable with them, and so they don't feel old to us. But this was, popular in this area in the 50s and 60s and into the 70s. And so these are houses reaching their 60th and 70th birthdays. And so they definitely meet our 50-year age rule. So when you're planning a survey, please include your ranch style and split level form neighborhoods, because they are historic and many of them are intact and eligible for the National Register. So keep that in mind.
Sherry, we did have a question come in. What is the difference between weatherboard and clapboard?
That's a good question. I'm not sure there is too much of a difference. I mean, weatherboard is, I think, the plain wood siding is we call it weatherboard. I'm not sure if that's a particularly satisfying answer. I don't know if Katie has a.
We use them pretty interchangeably as well. So
okay.
I think that our database has weatherboard in it, if I'm remembering right from looking at, from doing data entry, but we use them pretty interchangeably. There may be a technical, if you were to ask somebody that does siding, there may be a technical difference, but we use them pretty interchangeably. So.
I mean, if I was to give a slightly less censored and more honest answer, clapboard is more of a trendy HGTV term for me, and weatherboard is more of the appropriate architectural term. So we tend to hear clapboard because of the popularity of HGTV shows, but I think weatherboard is the more, for me, the more professional terminology.
Excellent.
I hope that doesn't upset anybody who likes HGTV.
Right.
So the last style I'm going to do is modernist. This is also known as contemporary, so either of those terms are appropriate. These are low-pitched, gabled houses. Often they're asymmetrical gables. They have wide eaves, and sometimes there are exposed roof beams under the eaves. The windows tend to be irregularly shaped, like this one here, and fill the gable and go, all the way up to the top sometimes. These are very windowy houses, which you can see here. This one's just down the street for me, and I always feel awkward when I go by because there are a lot of windows. You can just see right inside. They have a combination of materials pretty frequently too, and we see that here. There's can't tell if it's vertical board or a board and batten, but some kind of vertical wood here. And then this over here is either, it's probably a plain wood, but it could be a stucco or something like that. So combination of colors and materials. Texture in the walls too, you're not gonna see flat walls typically on a modernist contemporary house. So here recessed entries are really common, projecting bays. We have another little recessed area on the side here too. So a lot of texture and change in the walls of this style too. One thing to keep in mind with this is modernist style and mid-century modern movement are not interchangeable terms. The mid-century modern more typically identifies the movement and time period than the style of the building. So like the National Park Service includes things like Art Deco in the modern movement, but this is definitely not Art Deco. So you want to make sure to use modernist and contemporary to describe these building styles rather than mid-century modern. And then this last one, modernist style is really common to schools that were built in the 50s and a little in the 60s a little too. So you'll see the flat roof and bands of windows. They don't necessarily have to be placed quite as high or be as narrow on the building as these ones are. What you're looking for is a continuous line of windows without any exterior wall separating them. You often see, again, the combination of exterior materials, which you can see here, and recessed bays are really common too. Like all of these on the side here are all little recessed bays for each classroom, and then you see them coming down this way too. So the same stylistic elements but attached to a school building, and it tends to make them look very long and very low. They can be hard to photograph. You're going to have to back way, way up to get the whole thing in the shot. And often you'll have to take those pictures in pieces. So just a word of warning, be ready to get your 10,000 steps in. And we can pause again here and see if there are any more style questions before we go on to types.
We don't have any current, well, we had
There's one in the chat.
Yeah, about the national folk style, which I
So
pulled.
this is a McAllister. This is one of the parts of the McAllister book that in the preservation field, some people agree with, some people don't agree with. When we're talking about forms and vernacular architecture, this is kind of more where, at least in my understanding of this, what she calls a style. I don't know that I would necessarily call these a style.
Yeah, I've never used that word to describe a building in my work.
Yeah.
And that's true that's a fair point to bring up about McAllister. There are a handful in there that I probably wouldn't actually use in, practical application. And that's partly because they're not going to be as clean as what she's drawing in that book either. You're going to see multiple stylistic elements on almost every building that you see. And, but that's not one that I have ever used. And if you have questions about what to call something or whether a term is what SHPO likes, I'm just gonna volunteer Katie because that's what she does. But that's what she does. So call her or send her a picture and ask that question. That's what she's here for. Or frankly, you can ask consultants sometimes too. I would be happy to answer that kind of a question for a community member.
All right.
Are there any other questions that have
No,
come?
I think you'll get into a lot of I pulled up my McAllister to just make sure that I was
Yeah.
that I was
too,
right
Katie.
in what I remembered. Mom brain is a real thing. I can't think of anything right now, but
True story.
I think you'll cover most of what she covers in that chapter in the form section. So hopefully that will help answer some of the questions about that.
Oh, we just had a question come in. Arts and crafts as a style.
Arts and crafts is a movement, and craftsman is a style that fits within that movement. So arts and crafts applies to interior design and furniture, and it's a return to, so the period before that, you might order all of that fussy detailing for your Queen Anne house out of a catalog. And the arts and crafts movement comes along next, and it says, well, we're not going to do it that way. We want our local carpenter to make the details that are going on our house and want our local carpenter to make our furniture and want local artisans to create the things that we're using in our everyday life. So arts and crafts is more of a movement, similar to mid-century modernism movement. And then there are many things that fit into that.
All right, thank you.
Great question. Okay, so let's move on to type. I'm not going to go through all the types, but we'll do some of the most common ones. This is basically the historic use of the building. So a word of caution is to keep in mind that building use changes, and you want to think about what the building was built to be, not necessarily what it is adaptively reused as now. So residential is pretty obvious. It's the places we live, right? So houses, duplexes, apartment complexes, neighborhoods, all are residential examples. It could be that a house is now a library. So it's still a residential type, but its use has become public use instead. So, which is the case in Vicksburg. Their public library is in a beautiful old house. Commercial buildings, there's a lot of variety, but most of the things you would do in your typical survey are going to be these tidy downtown blocks of commercial buildings all attached together. You know, storefronts on the first floor, living space or event space up on the second floor, or offices on the second floor. But sometimes they'll be one story, and sometimes they'll be standalone buildings, and sometimes they'll be highly specialized. You might have a car dealership or something like that. So lots of variation, but most often you're going to see this type of a streetscape. You're going to see some schools in your average survey too. So educational buildings are important, and these are highly recognizable. We all went to school, so we know what these look like. And this one is a former school that is now an apartment building. And so another example where it's an educational type building, but its current use is residential. So make sure that you're clear about those distinctions and uses of the buildings. Community surveys are going to have a boatload of churches. So, but the good news is that like the previous types, these follow the same patterns of style and form that the other things that we've talked about do. So they're fairly difficult to photograph because they're big and often take up an entire block, and you have to figure out where the church ends and the education building begins and things like that. But they're easier to describe because they do follow those same patterns. Governmental buildings are going to be your courthouses and city halls, jails, municipal offices, all of those. And again, they follow the same patterns of style and form as the other building types. Transportation related buildings, of course, this is our cutie patootie depot here in Chelsea. Love this cute little building. And but it's not just train stations. It's going to be bus stations, lighthouses, airports, parking garages. And don't laugh, I surveyed 7 parking garages in Greensboro, North Carolina, because they were all brutalist styled buildings and super cool. So there are all kinds of transportation related buildings that you might survey during a community survey. And for the most part, they too follow those same patterns of style and form. And I wouldn't be from Chelsea if I didn't find a way to get Jiffy in here. So a quick word about industrial buildings. They're not terribly common during your average survey, but like here in Chelsea, our pocket of industrial is in the middle of the rest of our downtown. So you go from the historic houses to the historic commercial core, right into the industrial, and then back to the houses again. So if your survey area is mixed in that way, you're going to have these kind of buildings to survey. Again, you're going to get your steps in, trying to get far enough away to photograph these. Think about this as a complete complex. So how are the buildings working together? The railroad here is very important. And what are the other elements of the landscape that work with the buildings? A quick piece of advice is to find someone who works there because that's the best way to know what everything is, when it was built, how it was built. Industrial buildings are typically not styled, although they can be. So it can be really hard to place them in time. And unless you work in that particular field of manufacturing or whatever it may be, it's going to be a challenge to know what was going on inside these windowless boxes. So I've had the most success doing survey with industrial buildings by having somebody to give me a tour and walk around. Don't be shy, even during COVID. Find
As
somebody
somebody
and ask
who's
them.
also who grew up in Chelsea, Jiffy Mix does in non-COVID times does tours, and
They
it's
do
really
do
fun.
tours.
So.
That's right. And I think you get a free Jiffy Mix at the end too. You should come to our parades as well. We get Jiffy Mix all the time. That's what we do here. If you're doing a rural survey, you are going to find these little farms all over the place. This is a particularly good one. It's still an operating farm, so they're still using all of these buildings. As farms fall out of use and start growing housing complexes instead of crops, the barns start to disappear. But this one is still an active farm. So the outbuildings are going to follow the same patterns. Again, you use the same terminology to describe them. So, we have a gambrel roof barn with sliding doors. We have a side gabled shed of some sort with weatherboard. There's a metal corn crib with a conical roof back here, some sort of front gabled frame equipment shed. Again, the best way to find out what's going on inside those buildings is to find the owner and ask them. Also, if you're doing rural survey, you're probably going to do that anyway because you're going to want to knock on the door and tell them why you're there, and that will help you to get better documentation of the buildings. The houses are going to be quite a variety. Some will be styled. You will see Queen Anne and Italianate and sometimes Colonial Revival farmhouses across the state. You will also see vernacular houses with the details from one of those or more than one of those three styles frequently as well. And some will just be boxes that people live in. So you're going to have a lot of variety in farm houses. Again, you want to think about the complete landscape and think about this as an interactive complex. All of these buildings work together. You're going to want to make note of things like wells and the farm field patterns too. If the farm is still being farmed, what crops do you see? I think we all can recognize corn, wheat, and soybeans at least. And so you want to make note of those kinds of things when you're doing survey. There are a few other building types you might see. You might see something like a Masonic hall that would be a social category building, or recreational or cultural buildings like a museum or a stadium, something like that. Healthcare building like a hospital that sometimes can be very styled buildings as well. You might have an armory, so that would fall under a category of defense. So those can also be very highly styled. So those are just a few other things you might see that I'm not going to take the time to go through in detail, but there are lots of different building types. You will find a list in that National Register Bulletin 16B. And again, these will all follow, for the most part, the same patterns of form and style that we have spent all this time talking about. So. Okay, everyone feeling good and overwhelmed now? That was a lot really fast. I would remind you again, you don't have to memorize everything. just know where to find it again. Take a look at that resource handout we're going to send. Remember, your brain does not have to be a glossary of architectural terms. You do not have to have a stylistic Rolodex in your mind. You don't have to memorize all this stuff. Have some familiarity, have some resources. Know that you don't have to do it yourself. Our state has a lot of great consultants, I hope present company included. And if you do decide to do it yourself, you still don't have to do it alone. SHPO and Katie are here to help you. Many consultants, myself included, are happy to help communities plan survey and learn these terms and provide advice. So don't be shy about asking. So I hope this has been more helpful than overwhelming. And thank you again for participating. We'll see if there are any more questions, but if you think of something later, or if you're watching on replay, this is how to find me. Please don't hesitate to reach out.
All right, we did have one question just come up. So Carnegie Library designs reused for museums or another purpose are listed as cultural buildings, even if the current use is not cultural, ? So do you list the historic original intent of the building as its type or what its current type or current use is?
So I would normally include both. So I would say that that was built for use as a public building and is adaptively reused as something else. That's how I would describe that. That it has been like the school that's now an apartment complex. So it was built with an educational use, but now has a residential use. And so Carnegie libraries were built to be a library, and so that's why it has that sort of sturdy, trustworthy architecture, right? It's important to connect the purpose of the building to the way it makes you feel. And but now the building is used for something else. So it's I think important to identify both of those.
Yeah, and there's two spots. There's a spot for current use and historic use, and so you can. And again, you can add anything. We just don't want folks to take stuff off of the forms, but you can add things if it will be helpful. So.
Excellent. Well, we don't have any active, a question just came in. Is Victorian considered a style or a movement? It seems to be a catch-all.
It is a catch-all. That's a good question. And I should have just said this in the beginning. Victorian is an era. And so it's mostly for us, for the purposes of our architectural history, is the late 1900s. So Gothic revival up through Queen Anne and Richardsonian and all of that fits into the Victorian styles. They're also called Romantic sometimes, you might hear that. But Victorian technically refers to the area in which of the period of time when Queen Victoria was Queen of England. So it's a long period of time and sort of a broad term. So in McAllister, you'll see terms like folk Victorian to describe buildings. I showed you a folk Victorian according to her definition. I would call it a vernacular with Queen Anne details. So so you'll see that word pop up here and there, but I don't really use it. It's too vague, I think, to be precise in describing a building.
Yeah, I think when the term Victorian is used, it's usually referring to a Queen Anne. In how I've sometimes stumbled across that term. Yeah. So Queen Anne would be probably a more specific use of to characterize the structure. Well, I will do my closing statements quickly. But if you have any questions, do type them in, and then I'll let Sherry and Katie do their closing thoughts. Thank you all again for attending. We're so glad that you joined us this afternoon. I did put some information in the chat, which I will also include in our email. Registration is open for MHPN's conference. We are virtual this year, so we really hope that you will join us. We have 2 days packed with amazing sessions and presenters with a lot of really important conversations that will be happening regarding the preservation field. We are accepting scholarships through September 11th, and there is information on our website about how to apply, but I will also include that in the email. We have our next webinar in the afternoon is September 17th. We'll have wood window rehabber Dave Deppy with us, and he'll be talking about wood windows and energy efficiency to hopefully dispel some of the myths of energy inefficient wood windows. So I hope you'll join us. So we haven't had any more questions come in. So Sherry and Katie, if you guys have any closing thoughts, we'll wrap this up.
I would just say one more time, don't be overwhelmed. Don't feel like you have to go it alone. Don't feel like you have to memorize everything. There are a lot of people who are willing and happy to help, and myself and Katie are certainly among them. So don't hesitate to reach out and get help if you feel like you need it.
Yep. Yeah, I don't have anything other than just feel free to reach out. My contact info isn't on this PowerPoint, but it's on the last two, and Mallory can probably include it in the sheet that goes out as well. So feel free to reach out.
All right. Well, excellent. Thank you all for your time again, and we'll look forward to seeing you all on September 17th. Thank you and have a great day.
Thank you.